Welcome to 5 Good Questions. I'm your host, Jake Taylor. Our guest today is William Green. William is the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier: How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life. This book is based on hundreds of hours of interviews that he conducted over the last 25 years with a pantheon of legendary investors. Everyone from Sir John Templeton to Charlie Munger, Howard Marks to Joel Greenblatt, Ed Thorp to Nick Sleep. William's written for many publications, including Time, Fortune, Forbes, Barron, The New Yorker, and The Economist. He edited the Asian, European, Middle Eastern, and African editions of Time. Born and raised in London, he studied English literature at Oxford and has a master's degree in journalism from Columbia. He lives in New York with his wife Lauren and their 2 children, Henry and Madeleine. Let's ask William 5 good questions. But first, I'm happy to announce my literary debut, The Rebel Allocator, is now available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. You could say it's about time. I've been pouring my heart into this book for more than 3 years. A well-known SoCal billionaire received an early copy of the book and actually called me to say he enjoyed the story and was adamant that I get it made into a movie. Talk about a surreal experience getting 20 minutes on the phone with one of my heroes. My friend Tobias Carlyle had this to say: Jacob Taylor has written a modern-day investment classic. The Rebel Allocator is reminiscences of a stock operator for value investors. It's a fictionalized retelling of the lessons in The Intelligent Investor in an accessible page-turner. If you want to learn how to invest like Warren Buffett by sitting at his knee, this is the book for you. Wow, how flattering is that? I was blown away when he sent me that. I've created dozens of ad-free author interviews over the last 5 years and never asked for anything in return. If you've gotten any value out of these efforts, please do me a personal favor and pick up a copy of The Rebel Allocator. I promise you won't regret it. And now, on with the show. All right, welcome back to the program, everybody. My guest today is my good friend, William Green, and he is back on the show with his new book, Richer, Wiser, Happier. William, good to see you.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know, normally this time of year, I find myself in New York and across a coffee from you, and it's always one of the highlights of the trip. And obviously with not as much travel in the last year or so, for obvious reasons, it feels like a special treat to be able to catch up with you in this format. We might as well share it with everyone else.
It's great. I'm happy to be here.
Question number 1, that we just jump right into this. I was blown away by how you were able to get such world-class investors that I thought I'd read a lot about them, listened to every interview that they've done, but you got them to open up in ways that were just striking to me. And how'd you do that?
I think some of it is just trust that I built up over many years. I've spent a lot of time interviewing some of these people. So with someone like Bill Miller, who I interviewed again the other day for Barron's, I was calculating that I've probably interviewed him somewhere between 80, 90, and 100 hours over 20 years, starting with a profile that I did of him many, many years ago for Fortune, when everyone thought that Amazon was going to go bankrupt, and it was at something like $6 a share, and he had bought 15% of the company, and everyone thought he was just a total fool for doing this. And so there's a kind of trust that you build up over many years. I think partly when you don't try to stitch someone up, when you're trying to see the world through their eyes and present it in a deeply truthful way. I think that puts people at ease. Another thing I would say, I prepare enormously for these interviews. And so I think when somebody sees your seriousness, that someone asked Bill Miller actually this question the other day. We were doing a Clubhouse event, and they were saying, "How come you've opened up?" And he was saying, "Well, a lot of the interviews I've done are very mechanical, and I never felt that with William. I felt like he really wanted to find out what I thought." And it's not just that I was trying to figure out what they were thinking about the markets or what they were thinking about stocks. I was always trying to figure out actually how to live and how to wrestle with these problems of how do you deal, for example, with the fact that the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions about the future? Or how do you deal with the fact that we fail and we have setbacks and we have public humiliations and we have to pick ourselves up and nurse our wounds and find the strength to keep going? How do you deal with the fact that everything changes, nothing stays the same, and so you're trying to make bets about the future, which is inherently unstable and unpredictable. And so these are questions that when I'm interviewing people, I'm wrestling for the answer. And so I think they probably feel that I have skin in the game, that it's not mechanical, it's not perfunctory. And I think of a friend of mine who's a wonderful photographer who took the portraits for the Great Minds of Investing, the book that I did a few years ago. And I wrote an essay at the start of that where I was interviewing him. This is Michael O'Brien, fantastic portrait photographer, who did the famous photo that's of Buffett that's on the cover of Lowenstein's biography of Buffett,
top of the building,
like that, with gray skies behind it. I think it's in the Smithsonian's permanent collection or something like that. It's a National Portrait Gallery. It's a wonderful photograph, and so I interviewed Michael about what his technique was, and he said to me he'll take 200 to 300 portraits shots while he's taking it, and he said he doesn't speak. And he's so intensely engaged that they feel the engagement. And so when you think of those photos, say, of Buffett and Munger right up close with their eyes looking straight, and he wouldn't allow them to smile either, I think they're reciprocating his intense engagement. And so I think for me as well, the fact that I'm intensely engaged, I care about the answer, really leads people to open up. And then I think they sense whether you're judgmental or not, whether you're empathetic, whether you're out to get them, or whether you're out to actually present their view of the world in an authentic and truthful way. And then I would say that the last point I would make is just that I've really concentrated in this book on people who are self-aware and candid. And there are people that I've interviewed over the years who are multi-billionaires and are great money makers. I just don't find them very interesting because they're hiding. There was one person I interviewed a few years ago for a different project who I remember asking him a question about a collection of his, and he just got really uncomfortable about the fact that we were talking about this collection that was obviously worth an enormous amount of money. And I remember talking to Monish Pabrai about it afterwards and saying, that guy really made me feel uncomfortable. I really don't want to write about him. And Monish said, based on Power versus Force, the stuff that David Hawkins has written about being truthful, he said you could smell that he wasn't being truthful, and it just turned you off. And so I tend also to write about people who it's not that they're flawless or totally exemplary human beings, but they're self-aware and they're trying to look honestly at their own lives. And so it's infinitely more interesting to interview a Monish Pabrai who's going to tell you the truth, whether it sounds antisocial or not, or brusque or not, or Charlie who's going to tell you the truth, or Tom Gaynor, or Howard Marks. And so I think so there's some selection. Just I'm only really interested in people who are going to tell the truth, because or at least attempt to. I mean, we all probably distort things, but I think the intention of trying to explain how you view the world and trying to teach and share those insights, that's very important. And I think that's probably a characteristic of pretty much everyone I'm writing about in this book, Richer, Wiser, Happier. They're not hiding. They're searching as well for how you solve these problems of uncertainty and decision making, and what it means to have a truly abundant, rich life. What does that mean? They're wrestling with it as much as you and I are, I think.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue for question number 2, which is that what are some of the common traits running through these people? And really, the bigger question is, can we develop them in ourselves, or is it perhaps an innate thing and we sort of have the cards that we're dealt, and we may never be these people because it's just we didn't get those cards?
It's a bit of both, as you'd expect. I think one of the most striking things to me is how many of these people are extremely unemotional. And so you see it with someone like Howard Marks, for example, who manages $120 billion or something at Oaktree. And when I talked to him, say, about what he was doing during the financial crisis, it just became clear how differently wired he is from the rest of us. He basically talked to me about how over 15 weeks, while the market was imploding and no one was prepared to buy anything at any price, he and his partner, Bruce Karsh, were investing, I think, $500 or $600 million a week in toxic bonds, 15 weeks. And they ended up making something like,
grinds down every week.
Yeah. And he made something like $8 or $9 billion. And I said to him, and because he and Bruce Karsh are the biggest shareholders in the company, I mean, it was really the score of a lifetime. And I said to him, was it emotionally difficult for you? And he said, no, I don't remember it being difficult. And so, and that's despite the fact that he says that he is inclined toward being fearful. He's a slightly fretful worrier, natural born worrier, as he puts it. But there wasn't much evidence of it there. And I said to him, I knew that he'd been married twice. And I said, well, does that lack of emotion drive your wife crazy? And he said, oh yeah, it definitely drove my first wife crazy. And he said, but I think I've been better about it with the second wife. And there was something also wonderfully direct about that he didn't blanch at my question. He just answered it very straightforwardly. Yeah, it drove my wife crazy. And when I went to Los Angeles to interview Charlie Munger for this book, I was also very struck when we were talking about 2009. And he said basically he bought Wells Fargo for the Daily Journal at what he described as the bottom tick in March 2009. And I said, was that difficult for you emotionally? Are you feeling any anxiety or fear as the market's plunging? And in his very monosyllabic way, he was like, no. And I said, so you're not actually having to fight those emotions because you don't feel them. And he said, no, and Warren is wired exactly the same way. We don't feel it. And so I think that there's a curiosity there, which is that these people are just a little strange, some of them. I mean, not all of them. I mean, a lot of them are quite emotional. I mean, I remember Tom Gaynor saying to me, look, I lost all of my hair during the financial crisis. And because he's a very self-deprecating, humorous, gentle soul, I said, really? And he's like, no, really.
Not joking.
And not joking. And I think because he felt a tremendous sense of responsibility towards his shareholders, towards the employees of his company. I mean, he's a man with a real sense of duty and service. And so I think it was very painful for him. And likewise, he found it very painful during the dot-com bubble, where he made the mistake of shorting tech stocks. And his wife, who runs one of the businesses at Markel, said to me, both of those periods were dark nights of the soul for Tom. And so I do think you have to be aware of whether you're wired more like Tom and more like me and more like regular humans, or whether you're wired like these more machine-like, not in a derogatory way, but these people who are just wired so that they can calculate the odds and the probabilities in a totally dispassionate, rational way, which I think is one of the great advantages for someone like Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett, Howard Marks, Ed Thorp. These are just not hugely emotional people. They're hyper-rational people. And that self-awareness is hugely important. And so I write a great deal about how to deal with the emotions of life and the markets. And there's a chapter about Munger primarily called Don't Be a Fool, which is about reducing standard stupidities. But I talk a lot about how if you are emotional, as I am, if you are inclined to fear, if you are inclined to worry, or if you're inclined to get carried away when the markets are surging, for example, you need to be very self-aware and you need to find workarounds for your own emotions. And one of my favorite practical pieces of advice comes from a friend of mine, Ken Schubenstein, who's a remarkable person who I write about in that chapter, who actually quit the investment business a few years ago after a very successful career where he ended up with something like 350 employees at his private equity firm, hedge fund / private equity. and he quit to become a neurologist. And so here's a guy who's a real expert on the brain, who taught for a decade the advanced investment research course at Columbia Business School, been a very successful investor, but also understands the peculiarities of the brain. And one thing that Ken Schubenstein does is he has this very helpful mnemonic, which is partly drawn from scientific literature about addiction, about what leads people to make mistakes, fall back into sort of dangerous, destructive patterns. And his mnemonic is HALT PS, which is, it's a reminder that when he's hungry, angry, lonely, tired, in pain, sad, scared, those are preconditions for cognitive cock-ups, basically. There are times when you're just going to be more likely to screw up. And so he's extremely self-aware. And so over the last year, he's actually been treating COVID patients on ventilators and the like. I mean, the ultimate test, even more intense, I suspect, than what he'd been dealing with during the financial crisis, when he had a really terrible time. Lots of his investors bailed out at exactly the time when he wanted to be buying more. And he's used this mnemonic a lot while dealing with patients, because he said, if I'm having to call their family member who's not actually able to be in the hospital because of COVID, I'm having to call the family member and tell them whether their loved one is dying or whether they're improving. I need to be aware, for example, that my PPE, the equipment that I'm wearing, is physically painful, and to wear like a tight mask or goggles or whatever it is all day long is kind of excruciating after a while. And I'm tired, and I'm upset, I'm sad about the state of these patients. And so he was doing things like he would go into the bathroom and just take a kind of mindful moment for 20 seconds where he would just try to breathe, because he didn't have time to meditate. And he was constantly reminding himself, okay, HALT PS, this is the state that I'm in. I need to take extra care. I need to slow down. And I think that's fascinating, because if you're Charlie and Warren, maybe you don't need to do that. I mean, Charlie, I said to him when I was interviewing him, do you write down your checklist of things that you want to avoid? And he's like, no, it's all in my head. And I think anyone can do that. Bullshit. None of us can do that. There's no way I can remember all of the stuff that Charlie can remember. And just my awareness of how dumb I am in comparison, or how emotional I am in comparison, is really helpful. And so I think just that self-awareness, and then coming up with a few practical workarounds for our own emotion, so that you're aware, yeah, I'm not wired like this guy. And what am I going to do about it? And one of the most practical things that I've learned from Ken Schubenstein as well, that I saw him do this a lot while he was a hedge fund manager. I don't know if he's able to do it anymore because his schedule is so intense, is when he was under a lot of pressure, when he was really stressed, he would just go through his calendar and systematically reduce complexity by canceling things. And that's something that, because I'm inclined to become overwhelmed by complexity. I mean, I spend much of my life sitting alone in my study, reading books and thinking and trying to write and doing battle with the blank screen. That's a life in which there's actually pretty reduced complexity. And then suddenly you find, wait, you've got all of these appointments and these meetings and these interviews and stuff. And it's very easy for me to get overwhelmed and confused. And I'm always losing things. I can't remember anything. Like I'm a scatterbrained writer. And so the complexity is difficult for me. And so just to be aware that I need to reduce complexity as much as possible, that's another really powerful workaround. And so it all, I think, stems from self-awareness of knowing what the gap is between you and the people who are optimally built for this game. And I remember that's a phrase that Monish used with me once. He just said, I'm just optimized for the game of investing. He's just an unemotional guy. He has emotion, but when it comes to losing money, for example, like when he was down 67% during the financial crisis, it just didn't upset him. He said his wife at the time just didn't even know there was a problem. And he said, no, it was orgasmic because the prices were so low. And Bill Miller said the same thing to me the other day. He said, maybe I was dropped on my head when I was 6 months old, but I happen to believe that lower prices are better. And so these guys are just wired in a really interesting way, super rational, super dispassionate, odds-oriented, driven by probability, not by emotion. And so it's a temperamental advantage as well as an intellectual advantage that they have.
Yeah. So question number 3 has to do with a little bit more of our, you wrote this, a lot of it, the interviews were before a global pandemic. And then I'd be curious about what, if anything, you had to revise or if there was new thinking that came out. And I believe you told me in another conversation about Ed Thorp and how his approach to the pandemic was probably a pretty good, it's a good example of how different these people are a little bit.
Yeah, Bill Miller was saying to me the other day that Ed Thorp may be the most rational man alive. He's an extraordinary guy. And for listeners who don't know who Ed is, I describe him in the introduction to my book as probably the greatest game player in the history of investing. And here's a guy, he's now, must be about 86, 87. He was about 83 when I first interviewed him. And I met him in this beautiful hotel in New York City. And he looked about 60 years old, and he was about to marry his first wife had died after a long, very happy marriage of over 50 years. And he was about to marry, I think, a 50-year-old woman. And he's wearing a black leather jacket, and he just looks so cool and so young. And he just you look at this guy and you're like, this guy won the game of life. Very comfortable in his skin, charming, super intelligent. I mean, spectacularly intelligent. And one of the things that he's most famous for is that he figured out how to win at blackjack, which was a game that everyone had always said, well, you can't beat the casino. So he figured out how to count cards. And at one point was basically hired by one aspect of the mob to try to bankrupt another mob member, and then realized this is not a good bet. I didn't realize who I was being bankrolled by. And then later on, figured out how to win at roulette. So he and Claude Shannon, this legendarily brilliant guy from MIT, partnered up and I think built the first wearable computer. And Ed would activate it with the big toe inside his shoe. And so he's calculating the velocity of the rotator wheel and the ball. So what he said to me is, usually historically it was just a mug's game where there was an equal chance of the ball falling in any of those 38 pockets. But for me, I added a little bit of information, and that little bit of information tilted the odds in my favor. And so what I was really fascinated by with Ed was the fact that he has this kind of generalized rationality that he applies to everything in life. And so I thought, well, it would be really interesting to fact check with him and to update the book and to say, how did you approach COVID? Because what I found when I re-interviewed about 16 of the investors in my book to see how they dealt with COVID, they acted in ways that were totally and utterly emblematic of everything that they do. So Tom Gaynor wanted to be an exemplary role model. So he felt that there were people within his company who were exposed because they were working on the front lines in different ways. So he took great care, but he went to the office every day to headquarters because he said there were only about 10 of us in the headquarters, but I couldn't be hiding away at home while asking other people to expose themselves. And it was very characteristic. And he also said, yeah, I'm just putting one foot ahead of the other. It's just steady incremental progress. I'm just trying to deal with the problem. Monish Pabrai, no problem at all with COVID. He was like, this is an amazing opportunity to buy a mall operator while all of the malls are closed. So he plunges in and buys 13% of Seritage growth properties at a moment when nobody at all wanted to buy it, and bought it at something like a fifth of the price that Warren Buffett had paid for his own personal portfolio. And so then Ed Thorp, I say to him, so Ed, how have you thought through COVID? And he sort of says, thank you for asking. And you could see, oh, this guy's thought about it. And he then he then explains how basically right at the start of COVID, so I guess this would be January 2020, before there were any deaths in the US, when we still were largely thinking, well, this is a problem in Wuhan and maybe it's spreading around China, he was already looking at the data from Wuhan himself objectively. And he was particularly interested in unexplained deaths. And then he was also drawing inferences from the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, which had killed his grandfather. And so he said, I basically calculated my own estimate of the fatality rate, the true fatality rate. So here again, as with roulette, as with blackjack, as with running his hedge fund, he said, when there's a difficult problem, when there's a problem there are high stakes, you don't just listen to the authorities, the experts. He said, it makes no difference to me if the expert said to me that you can't win at blackjack or you can't win at roulette. He said, you take the evidence and you analyze it for yourself. And so here again, he starts to analyze the evidence about COVID and fatalities himself. And basically, I think it was around February 7th, if I remember. I'm probably getting that slightly wrong, but it was before there was a single death announced in the US. He gathers his whole family together in California, and he says to them, over the next 12 months, I think there are going to be 200,000 to 500,000 deaths from this new coronavirus in the US alone. And that's extraordinary. This is a time when you have the government saying, no, it's no problem, and just calling it the Chinese virus, just trying, and people saying no need to buy masks, anything like that. Yeah. So he said, I started to take precautions. And so we went to the supermarket a month before the shelves were cleared out, and we bought masks and we bought detergent and hand wipes, all of these things. Toilet paper. And he said, and I proceeded to put myself in isolation with my wife. And he said, I'm 86 years old or whatever. He said, I have no comorbidities. I'm extremely healthy. I walk 3 miles a day. I see a personal trainer a couple of days a week. So I'm very fit and I'm very careful. So he said, if I get COVID, the chances are somewhere between 2 and 4% of me dying. So he calculated the probability of his own death, which I've not seen with anyone else. And he said, that doesn't sound too bad, but actually it's plenty high. And I need to survive catastrophe. I need to avoid catastrophe, which is a quintessential approach of the great investors. It's how do you stay in the game? And that applies to COVID. It applies to markets. You don't want to be blown out of the game. And so he puts himself in isolation. He said he would allow his kids who were adult to come over, but they would meet outdoors and with masks on and keep their distance. And I just thought that was a quintessential piece of rational thinking, where you look at the evidence for yourself. You don't. Politicians are born to lie, right? I mean, they spin, they lie. They're not in pursuit of truth. And someone like Ed, he's just not going to listen to what politicians are saying. He's weighing the evidence for himself. He's calculating the probability of different outcomes. He's brutally honest about his own vulnerability as a guy in his 80s, albeit with no comorbidities. And then he's ensuring that he survives. And I just think that's a fabulous example of how we should all try to think about life, try to think about markets, try to be guided by what he calls this generalized rationality. And he applies it in every area. So he would say, when I'm upset with someone, when I'm annoyed with someone or irritated with someone, he says, I really pause and say, what's the evidence here? Am I right to be annoyed with them? And he said, one aspect of rationality is simply to suspend judgment, to delay judgment. And that it sounds kind of simplistic, right? But it's actually really important if you think about it. If you think about the people who upset you at work or in your family, and then, in the supermarket, and then you just say, well, let me just pause and suspend judgment and see where they're really coming from, and whether I'm just in a state where I'm likely to be overreacting. And he said, in many cases, he finds that actually, in retrospect, he's like, yeah, actually, they didn't do anything wrong. I'm glad I suspended judgment.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful things I've ever read was, I believe it was Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning. And he said something like, and I'm probably a little off on this, but that your power lies between the impulse and the response.
Yeah, between stimulus and response. I never know if that was actually truly said by him or not. It may have been attributed to him, but George Mumford often quotes it from him. It's great.
It's either him or the Buddha, one of those two.
Yeah, but no, I mean, Frankl definitely spoke about it, this idea that between stimulus and response, you have the choice, and part about how to react. And part of what you're doing with meditation is slowing down that response. And if you think about Ken Schubenstein with Halt PS, with knowing that in certain states he's going to be more inclined to cognitive screw-ups, it's the awareness of your own state. It's listening. It's knowing when you're emotionally flooded, when you're fearful, when you're hungry, when you're just depressed. And there's a lot of literature on this, scientific literature. Ken Schubenstein drew my attention to this overview of something like 35 years of studies on the way emotion distorts our judgment. And so it's interesting to me that there's this commonality between Viktor Frankl, who is this extraordinary psychiatrist, George Mumford, who was inspired by Viktor Frankl, who's a recovered heroin addict who became a meditation coach to people like LeBron James and Michael Jordan, and is helping people like that deal with their emotion in extreme circumstances. Investors and doctors like Ken Schubenstein, who are figuring out how to draw from the scientific literature to make less rash decisions. And one of the things, there's a beautiful phrase from Josh Waitzkin, whose book, The Art of Learning, I would highly recommend to anyone, where he talks about thematic interconnectedness. And I think when you find these principles that run through multiple areas, it's a sign that it's probably true. And one of the things that I think is an idiosyncrasy of my book is that because I'm weird and read just a ridiculous array of things, my mind, the fact that my mind is scattered is an advantage in certain ways, because I'm just going off in all different directions, inquiring about all different disciplines. That means I'm finding these connections in all of these different areas. And so I think that idea of the gap between stimulus and response, and our ability to find mechanisms to delay responding, that's hugely important. And one of the things that Ken Schubenstein said to me that I think is very powerful is he said, you don't want to wait for the storm until you start to adopt these good habits. He said, the reason you meditate is not for the day when the market falls 20%, or when you suddenly discover there's a new pandemic or a new variant or something like that. You meditate because, in a sense, you're priming yourself for difficulty. And what he said, again, to get back to a very practical thing that he said, I audited his class at Columbia Business School for a semester, and he was talking about the fact that we know from the scientific literature that there are 4 things that affect the functioning of our brain, and I mean, it's been demonstrated time and time again in the lab. So we know that sleep has an effect. We know Matthew Walker's book on sleep. I interviewed Matthew Walker at some point. It's an important and very profoundly helpful book, Why We Sleep. We know that nutrition has a tremendous effect on our cognitive function. We know that exercise has a tremendous effect, and we know that meditation does as well. And so part of what you're doing is you're adopting these good habits actually during the good times.
Yeah, before you need them.
Before you need them. And what I've often found in my own experience is that I wait too long, and suddenly I realize, man, the wheels are falling off this bus, and I'm totally out of control, and I've lost my way, and I need to get back. And then I'll start to get serious about exercise and meditation and stuff again. And it's the wrong approach. It's while times are good, bed those habits down. I think one of the great things in trying to find a silver lining during this period of the pandemic so it's been hugely challenging for many of us in all different ways, is I just decided I'm going to come out of this period, God willing, with a serious meditation habit and a serious exercise habit. And I really bedded down those two things. And the last couple of weeks, I haven't been meditating because I've been so busy talking about great investors. Yeah, so I'm a terrible advertisement for my own teachings. But I have tried to keep exercising very consistently, which is not something I enjoy doing. But I think the recognition that you're not going to function well, you're not going to think well, if you're not taking these 4 levers very seriously, is very helpful. And if you're Buffett, you can get away with eating crappy burgers on your way to your office every morning, picking up your cheeseburger or whatever. But I'm not Buffett, and so I have to take much more care over my diet, my exercise. And I do remember, I think in Poor Charlotte's Almanac, if I remember rightly, there is a letter that I think Charlie wrote to someone like Nixon or something about diet. I mean, so there was a period where Charlie had taken dieting pretty seriously in his youth. Now he doesn't look very tubby at all. But diet is important, and I think these mundane things are surprisingly important, and they're just tilting the odds in your favor of succeeding in every area of life. And this is one of the things I write about in writing about Tom Gaynor, is that it's not some single secret source. Yeah, it's great if you have Ed Thorp's IQ, but good luck with that. I mean, I'm probably 70 points behind Ed. And so I think a lot of it is about what Nick Sleep referred me to, the coach of the British cycling team, Sir David Brailsford, who talked about the aggregation of marginal gains. And it's a beautiful idea that you just take a lot of small things and get them right, and then keep plugging away doing these small things right. And I think this is one thing that regular mortals like you and me can do to maximize the odds of success in a very powerful way, and they're not big things to do. So that's very heartening, and that's why there's a chapter called High Performance Habits, where I talk about what these little things are that seem insignificant but add up. In just the way that the British cycling team, literally, they would carry their own pillows when they went on tour, because if you slept crappily, you were just tilting the odds against yourself. And they would have heated shorts so that their muscles were in a slightly better state when they were racing. Or they hired a surgeon to come in and talk to them about how to wash their hands properly, as in a surgery that's long before COVID, just because they understood that they would then be less likely to get colds and be sick. And so those sound like such trivial things that it's almost comic. But if you add many of these little things, many of these little habits together, over time, it's tremendously effective. And this applies both to investing and life. And so you see it with someone like Tom Gaynor, who basically has had these 4 same investment principles for the last 30 years. And he just applies them to every single company that he analyzes. And so they're just guardrails, as he puts it, to prevent him from being stupid. And so if you do that the whole time, just as you create a quiet environment for yourselves where you can think carefully, or just as you focus on your exercise and your diet and your emotional equanimity, those are very powerful things over time.
Kind of reminds me a little of the story of John Wooden would supposedly, first day of practice, and these are college age men, show them how to put their socks and shoes on correctly, because a sock that's not completely on right turns into a blister, which turns into missed practice time, which turns into sub-performance in the game. And you can see how it breaks down from this one little thing that you got wrong.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's the precision, it's the little things. And Nick Sleep, who is one of the most fascinating characters in the book and never really spoke before in public. I spent a lot of time talking about talking with him about what works in both in investing and life. And he talked about this British entrepreneur he'd become enormously successful. I think it was the guy who was running Carpetright. It was a very successful company that he'd taken over when he was something like 15 or something from his father. And he used to write on both sides of the price labels. And Nick was saying that's the sort of thing. It's these tiny little things, these little things that they get right over and over again. And he told me a story as well about Costco, which is something that he's owned for 18 years or so, which is in many ways the perfect example of what he regards as the most powerful business model of all. And he said there was a time when, through some weird mishap or some shift in currency or something like that, they suddenly had a pair of trousers that they could sell at a much higher profit margin, and nobody would know the difference. And it was totally justified. And the CEO at the time, I think it was probably Senegal, said, no, we'll know. And it'll set a bad precedent internally. So they just added their usual margin of something like 14%, even though it meant that they would make less money. And so it's those little things like that that actually really count, because they're emblematic of the bigger things. And it's what was that great line from Buffett and Munger about with habits that they become, so tight, the chains that bind you so tight. But at first it doesn't seem like anything.
You feel them until you're locked.
Yeah. And so I think understanding that there's not one great secret source, unless you happen to be just, meteorically clever or totally unemotional. Maybe then there is more of a secret source. But I think for most of us, it's much more about avoiding lots of dumb stuff and getting lots of little stuff right, and then continuing to do it over time. And so one of the things that made me go big on writing about Tom Gaynor is I think he is a regular human being. He's a highly intelligent, highly capable individual, and he works incredibly hard. But he's very replicable, because he doesn't have the superpowers intellectually or emotionally of a Munger or a Thorp or a Buffett. He's a very high functioning individual who he has a Post-it attached to his computer that's a quote from Michael Jordan, basically about how, because he failed over and over again, he succeeds. And he likes the fact that Jordan was a failure at high school basketball, and through what he calls superhuman work ethic, ended up becoming the greatest player of his generation. And I think what Tom Gaynor does, that it's a phrase that I've repeated again and again, much to the frustration probably of my two children, is that he's directionally correct. Mm-hmm. And I think that idea is very, very beautiful and very simple, that instead of trying to be optimal, you want to be directionally correct. And Tom talks about how when he decided that he was going to lose 10 pounds, he decided, I'll lose 1 pound a year over 10 years, because these small incremental advantages add up, because our good moves compound and our bad moves compound as well. And I think, so he said to me, look, I used to have the eating habits of a campground raccoon. And so I would eat 200 donuts a year, say. And he said, now I maybe eat 20 donuts a year. And I think that's really interesting, the idea that instead of trying to be perfect, you just try to be directionally correct. And his view is that for most of us, that's much more sustainable. And I don't think that's the case for everyone, because I remember Tony Robbins once saying to me that for some people, actually fasting is easier than moderating your diet. And I think for me, that actually is easier. I do intermittent fasting, because basically, once the floodgates are open, the food just pours in.
Moderation's too hard.
Moderation's really hard for me, and especially once you start eating bread and stuff, and it has this, I guess, physiological impact on you, and you just start to want more sugar and more. So actually, for me, I suspect it's better to be extreme in certain areas. But I
Perfect,
think for some
perfect segue question for about extremism. A lot of the people who you interviewed, like they've reached the highest levels of wealth and achievement, whatever that means. But it seemed to me like a lot of them had to sacrifice a lot to get there, and maybe even their own personal happiness. I can't help but wonder sometimes. But who that you interviewed seemed like they were the happiest, and maybe why were they potentially happier?
I end the book by writing about Arnold Vandenberg, and I try to explain that in some ways, even though he's not the most famous investor in the book, I regard him in some ways as the most successful human being in the investment community that I've interviewed over the years.
It's probably my favorite chapter.
Is that right? I'm so glad to hear it. It was interesting to me because when I initially pitched the book to Scribner, which is an august old publisher that published Hemingway and Fitzgerald and stuff like that, my editor there, who's a very brilliant guy, who's the executive editor, Rick Horgan, he sent me this scarily intelligent response to my book proposal. And one of the points was, I don't understand why Vandenberg is in there. And that was one of the great challenges for me, was to say, no, here's why Vandenberg's in here. Here's why he's important. And by the time we were done, Rick Horgan said, yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the book, and the challenge actually was very helpful because it forced me to think harder to justify my inclusion of him. And for people who don't know Arnold's story, which I tell in great detail in that section, it's a remarkable and dramatic and moving story where he was born in 1939 as a Jewish kid in the Netherlands, as on the same street as Anne Frank, and was hidden by a Christian family of friends that were they built a fake wall basically to hide his family. And Arnold's parents had this terrifying realization that if the Nazis came in and searched the house, if Arnold or his older brother Sigmund cried, then they'd be discovered. And if you were thrown in Auschwitz, the women and the children were the first to be killed. And so his parents took this very bold decision where basically they got in touch with the underground. And this girl who was probably 17, who didn't know them, was a Christian kid, doesn't know this family, and risks her life to smuggle Arnold out of hiding across the country into an orphanage where he was hidden. And so he spent the next 4 years in this orphanage and came out at the age of 6. And his parents had both been in Auschwitz because they were caught, and they actually amazingly survived in Auschwitz. But when they came to pick him up when he was 6, he was so emaciated that he could no longer walk because he'd been so malnourished. And he said to me that he couldn't recognize his parents, but he didn't even care. He would have done anything to get out of there. And he told me an extraordinary story that isn't in the book, where he said many years later, he and his lovely wife, Eileen, went to visit his parents, and they got flowers for his parents. And he said as they were going to his parents, he just started to cry uncontrollably, and he had no idea why. And he said he later realized that the flowers they had got for his parents were flowers that he used to eat in the field at that orphanage because they had so little food. And it just brought back this terrible memory of the lack in his childhood. And he said a few months later, if his parents hadn't come within the next few months, his father said, you would have died. I mean, he was just skin and bones. His father was afraid to pick him up. And so here's a guy who started with the worst possible hand. I mean, it wasn't just that he was in hiding. It wasn't just that he was sent away. He was separated from his brother who stayed on a farm with a couple that didn't have a child. So he had all of that trauma of separation and isolation. But he actually, for many years, felt that his mother had sent him away because she didn't want him. He was too young to understand that they were trying to save his life. And then he comes out of hiding and is rescued by his parents, goes eventually to this very tough neighborhood in East Los Angeles where he's beaten up constantly. I mean, on his first day at school, he wears lederhosen and long socks because his mom thinks she should dress up beautifully to go to this really rough school in a tough neighborhood. And so he's beaten up on his very first day at school. And so just this series of difficulties. And one day he hears his mother talking to a psychiatrist about him because he says, I guess it was turning out that I just wasn't too bright and they were really worried about me. And he hears the psychiatrist say, well, he probably has brain damage from being malnourished at such an important stage in his development. And so Arnold grew up thinking that he was dumb and unloved and with tremendous amounts of rage towards his parents who were very tough, very difficult parents, against the Nazis, against the anti-Semites who would beat him up on his way home from school. And what's extraordinary to me is that he took control of his inner landscape. He took control of his thoughts and his emotions, and he totally transformed himself. And one of the things that he would do, he literally learned self-hypnosis, but he used affirmations. He would walk around saying to himself the whole time, I'm a loving person. And so he took all of the anger that he felt that could have destroyed his life. And he figured out that the anger, however justified it is going to destroy my life. And so he managed to forgive the Nazis. He managed to forgive his parents. He managed to totally rewire his thinking. And so that's a triumph in its own right. Then he discovers Ben Graham, teaches himself to invest, and sets up his own firm at the age of 35 with no office, no clients, no experience, no college degree, just with these inviolable principles that he'd learned from Graham, and then does enormous amounts of work to study the private acquisition value of certain companies in different industries. So he develops these rules of thumb that really served him incredibly well over decades, just through common sense, and decided he went at some point. His first wife had left him, and he had a period where he was very depressed for several years. And he was lucky enough to find this extraordinary therapist. And this goes back to what I was saying at the start of the conversation, that I tend to focus on people who tell the truth, who are transparent. And he talked about going to this psychiatrist, Dr. Rameljak, who he still speaks of with reverence and affection decades later. And he said, I don't understand why that girl saved my life. Why would she risk her own life for somebody she didn't know? And why on earth would her father allow her to do that, to risk her life? And he said, well, my shrink said, well, it's simple, it's obvious. And he said, really? Why? What's obvious? And the psychiatrist said to him, well, for some people, their life is more important than their principles. And for other people, their principles are more important than their life. And Arnold took this very much to heart and decided that he wanted to lead a life that was really driven by principle. And so not only did he take control of his thoughts and his mind and his inner landscape, but he became this very ethical, very decent, very selfless, very kind person. And you see how sharing he is, how much joy he takes in really being kind to other people. And I've seen this myself because he's been wonderful to me over the years, just incredibly supportive. And that's an extraordinary characteristic. And he asked me a few weeks ago, because we talk fairly often, and he said to me, I don't really understand why after you've interviewed so many extraordinary investors, why you would say I'm the best role model that you would pick if you had to pick only one role model. And there was something really humble about it. He wasn't looking for me to prop up his ego. He was curious, like, why would anyone admire me so much? And I said to him, you really took control of your emotions in your life and your mind, and you turned everything around, which is an extraordinary thing to do and a great model for all of us. And B, I see the joy that you take in sharing with other people and helping other people. And he said, he's always a great storyteller. And he suddenly forgot that he'd asked me this question. And he's like, it's funny you should say that, because I have this friend from high school. He's still incredibly close to, he's 81 now. He's incredibly close to his three best friends from high school, who would always get in fights where they would always come to each other's aid and help each other. And they were all tough kids who were all from physically abusive families, but they stood up for each other. And he said one of them had this car that he just loved at high school, and he'd saved up. He was from a poor family. He buys this car, and then one night smashes up the car, and he calls Arnold, and Arnold says, I'll come over. And he goes to seize the car, and his friend is just devastated. And he says, no, it's not so bad. We can fix this. He's like, let's go to the scrapyard. We'll get a new fender. We'll get new this. We'll fix it up. And his friend's like, really? You think it's not that bad? And Arnold's like, yeah. No, we can sort it out. And so they go to the scrapyard. They spend ages fixing up this car. They spray paint it, make it all better. And he said, and I have a photo of my friend standing next to that car after we'd fixed it up. And he said, I've kept that photo in my office all these years because it just gives me so much joy. And he said, I get as much joy out of the fact that I helped him fix it and that he was happy as I would have got if it was something for me. And I think that's an astonishing characteristic to have in life, where I think the Buddhists call it empathetic joy. It's one of the great virtues.
Mudita, I think it's called.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And does it translate as empathetic joy, something like that?
Yeah. It's the exact opposite of Schadenfreude.
Yeah. I mean, I heard last night that a guy in the year above me at high school, who I was resented because he was better looking and more charming and more popular, won an Oscar, and it's his second Oscar. And there was a moment of pain where I thought, man, here I am at 52 years old, and I still that touches some part of my sense of inadequacy and jealousy. And at this age, I can look at that and think, yeah, well, that's a part of my personality too, and let me try to let that go. But it's there; it's part of my makeup, and I try not to repress it so much. I try just to be like, yeah, it's part of the mix. We're flawed individuals, but I think Arnold, through some quirk of temperament, has deep joy from sharing with other people. And I see it also with my friend Guy Spear, who I helped write his book, The Education of a Value Investor. And there are things that have happened to me in my life that have been good, where I can see he takes as much pleasure in them as if they had happened to himself. And that's an extraordinary talent. And what Guy said is that when he started out in his compounding goodwill program of just trying to be really kind to people and really helpful, he said that it was really motivated by the fact that he thought it would help him. It would help him get ahead.
Reciprocity part of it.
Yeah, exactly. And then he said at a certain point, he became so addicted to the good feeling that he had in himself from helping other people that it actually became sincere. And now it's just a joyful. It is an operating principle. I think for all of us, it's hard to overcome our agendas totally, but I see deep joy in Guy in helping people as well, and just a real kindness and enthusiasm. And thank God I've been the beneficiary of it many times, but I see it in a very, very pure way, I would say, with Arnold. There was a thing I reminded him that he'd totally forgotten, where I said to him, I remember you telling me once, one of the times that I interviewed him, it was over the phone, this is probably about 5 years ago. So I talked to him so many times. He had just been in some store, and there was a girl in front of him who said she was like I think she was like a 19-year-old girl, Latina from Texas, who he said was going to leave. She was talking to someone, and it became clear to him that she was going to leave Texas for the first time in her life. And was going to, I think it was the graduation of her brother or cousin or something in the Marines. And he hears this, and he says, he takes out $100 bill from his wallet, and he says, I want to give you this so you can take your relative out to celebrate. And she said, I can't take this from you. You're a total stranger. And he's like, no, you don't understand how much pleasure it gives me to be able to help you do that. And he said to me that his wife, there was he said she never knows how much money we have. It's only, all she knows is whether she has enough to share with people. And I don't mention this in the book, but I remember him saying, I think it was like someone who is a helper of theirs, like a cleaner or something like that, was going on vacation, and Eileen, his wife, looked in her wallet and she didn't have any money to give her to help her have a better vacation. And he said she was like, no, just wait there. And she ran into the house, and he said when she found that she had a little bit of money that she'd come out and give to help, he said the joy he saw on her face, just like utter joy that she was going to be able to help. And I think that's a very hard thing to fake. And when you see people taking that degree of pleasure in other people's happiness, it's this great paradox that most of us are on the hedonic treadmill, right? Where we're hedonists, just trying to find one more hit of short-term energy to make us happier. Let me eat another donut, or get more praise for whatever I've done, or we're constantly seeking validation or new hits of energy, even if it's just a like or a good review or something like that.
Yeah.
And the great paradox, I think, is that when you become more sharing and more loving and kinder and more compassionate, it actually makes you happier. And so I think that was something that I was really trying to convey by writing about Arnold. And the quote that I use, that's the section headline for that section, is he said, "I'm the richest man in the world." And I think, it reminds me of Tom Gaynor saying to me, my father was the richest man I ever met. And here's Tom, who is was on the board of the Washington Post with Buffett and knows Buffett. And he says, look, this is a psychological statement. My father was richer than all of these people because he had enough. And his father was obviously a really wonderful guy who was the biggest role model for Tom. And he had, I think, 100-acre farm in Salem, New Jersey. And he used to put together property deals occasionally, small property deals. And he used to be an accountant. And he was just a happy, resilient guy who had been shot in the knee during World War II, and somehow just would get through life in a really happy, decent way. Cheerfully resilient. And so I think when you see people like Tom Gaynor, Arnold Vandenberg, Nick Sleep in the book, they strike me, not to idealize or lionize everyone, because we all have our flaws and foibles, but I think they embody a lot of the characteristics that I aspire to develop. And one of the reasons I was writing about them is because I'm trying to figure out what works in life. What does the money actually give you? What doesn't it give you? And Ed Thorp, I asked him, if you were to approach life as a game, given that you've won every other game, whether it's roulette or blackjack or investing in a hedge fund, how would you approach life? And he said, nothing matters more than your relationships. That's it. That's the single most important thing. And he said, who you spend your time with is the most important thing. And like many great truths in life, it's pretty darn simple. I mean, but it's really easy to lose touch with that. And I remember interviewing Jean-Marie Eveillard for the book, and he was pained by the fact that because investing and beating the market over decades was so psychologically demanding and so intellectually demanding and so captivating, that he said he kind of neglected his two daughters, and he said they paid a price for it. And I said to him, would you have been as successful an investor if you'd been a better father, do you think? And he said, I don't know. Life is not simple. I don't know. And so I think there is a conflict between happiness and success if you're so maniacally focused on your work that you neglect your family. If you're so maniacally focused on becoming rich, I think there's some kind of short circuit if you're not also sharing a lot, and you're not focused on other people. But it's complicated because, as I write in the book, excellence demands extreme focus. And so even when you look at someone like Tom Gaynor, who is likes to describe himself as not extreme, is still pretty extreme by most people's standards. And someone like Arnold Vandenberg said to me, when he started out as a money manager, he said, I really loved chess. And so he said, I gave it up because I just couldn't do that. And he said he played golf one time and he said, I can see this is a game that's going to shackle my mind. And so he gave it up. And so that's extreme focus. And so I don't want to be naive about this and say that you don't need extreme focus to be very successful. But I think when you look at people like Ed Thorp or Tom Gaynor or Arnold, it gives you clues as to what works in life. And Thorpe said to me that when he set up his fund, he set it up in a way where he said, if I were the shareholder, what would I regard as fair? And so he structured in a way where there was an alignment of interest. And he said, you can get an edge in life by ripping other people off and just looking out for yourself. But he said, maybe you get to rip more raw meat off the carcass of life. But he said, when you look back at the end, you have nothing. And you just pursued the wrong thing all along. And that to me was very powerful. I'm not trying to be naive and to say, yeah, you can't get an edge by being self-serving, sharp-elbowed, unethical. Yeah, you can get an edge of a certain type, but at the end, you're kind of left with nothing. And Nick Sleep said to me a wonderful thing where he said, good behavior has a longer shelf life. I thought it was very striking that when I went to his office on the King's Road in London to interview him and Zach, his partner, they closed the fund years ago and returned $3 billion to their shareholders so that they could spend the second half of their lives giving most of their money away. And they were only 45 when they retired. And you can see deep affection between these two guys. Like, they really treated each other well. And the fact that they still share an office after all these years, that's really interesting. So I would say that simple idea that good behavior has a longer shelf life, and that I think runs through a lot of these people that I write about. Howard Marks talks about his pride, not in the fact that he's worth a couple of $1 billion, but in the fact that he and Bruce Karsh, his partner, haven't had an argument in 30 years. And he was really careful about making sure that I gave enough credit to Bruce Karsh for his role during the financial crisis, for example. And I think that's really interesting, that most of us want to take more of the credit and make people think we're better. And I think there's something really revealing about these habits, like wanting to share the credit, wanting to treat your partner fairly, wanting to treat your shareholders fairly. And these are not super complex ideas, but it goes back to Charlie Munger's beautiful line where he says, take a simple idea and take it seriously. And that to me is one of the single most important lines in my book, because what you're really trying to do is take a number of really simple but really powerful and really robust ideas and apply them throughout your life. And they give you a tremendous advantage over decades.
So question number 5 is maybe a little bit of a tougher question, but we're perhaps towards the end, who knows, but of a 40-year bull run in bonds, which saw interest rates fall from the high teens to zero, basically. And any phenomena like that spans an entire career for a lot of people has the potential of creating kind of a survivorship bias to it. Do you think that there are any wrong lessons to be learned from sampling some of the people that have been really successful over that time period that might steer us wrong over the next 20-year possible time period?
Well, I focus a lot on investors who've done well over many decades. And I think even with someone as brilliant and successful as Peter Lynch, who I did interview and I quote in the book, as far as I recall, he only really had a 13-year career as a fund manager. And that may have coincided with a period that was particularly good for the type of retail stocks that he owned. And he was clearly extraordinary, and there was an intensity to him. I mean, I remember Bill Miller telling me that early in his career, Peter Lynch gave him career advice, and he was talking about how I don't think he took a vacation in many years, and he would work at the weekend, and he would carpool every morning at 6:30 in the morning so that he could be studying the research in the car. And he just had this view that if you turn over more rocks, you'll find more great stocks. So maybe he would have done well in any period, but it's not really clear. And so I think this idea that what you really want to do is to set yourself up to do well over many decades, and then to understand this very fundamental idea that avoiding catastrophe and building resilience both in your life and your portfolio is critical. I think that's really important. And one of my favorite investors in the book is a guy called Matthew McLennan, who took over from Jean-Marie Eviard, and he manages about $90 billion. And this is a very, very smart guy and very polymathic and profoundly intellectual, which is interesting because he grew up literally in a house with no running water and no heat and no refrigerator, and in Papua New Guinea of all places, because his parents were kind of intellectual adventurers. And one of the things that Matthew McLennan is obsessed with is this idea that the next period is unlikely to look the same as the current period or the most recent period. And he talks about, for example, this period between, say, 1911 and 1913, where he says, you'd look around the world and you'd say, well, everything's glorious and it's great, and we've whipped inflation, and we've just had a long period of great growth around the world, and we've had peace, and all is good. And then, as he describes it, you have this series of catastrophic events, starting with the sinking of the Titanic, this unsinkable ship in 1912, which is a beautiful reminder that we can never tame nature, which is something we've re-experienced with COVID. An obvious lesson, but one that's really important. Then you had World War I in 1914. You had the Spanish flu that killed about 40 or 50 million people from 1918 to 19. You had massive inflation in Germany, which led to the rise of Hitler starting in about 1923. You had the crash of 29. You had the Great Depression. And then you have World War II breaking out in 1939 to 45. So you have this glorious period right before World War I breaks out, followed by 3 decades of disaster. And so McLennan's point is, you want to position yourself so that you benefit from the forward progress of mankind, but that you also survive the dips. And that to me is an immensely important phrase, to survive the dips. And that really applies not just to investing, but to every area of life. And it goes back to what Ed Thorp was saying about surviving the COVID period, about removing the likelihood of catastrophe because you don't want to get knocked out of the game. And one of the things that McLennan reminded me of was there was a beautiful piece of writing from Buffett after 9/11, where Buffett was saying, we really underestimated the risk of terrorist attacks. And he said it was a classic mistake that the entire insurance industry made, which is to focus on experience rather than exposure. And so everyone was so busy thinking, well, it's unlikely that New York would be attacked in this way, or it's unlikely now that we would have a pandemic, for example, that would close every mall, every shop, force all of us to be at home, drive us all to get everything delivered, cause millions of deaths in the course of a year or so. And McLennan's point is that we should focus much more on our exposure. And I think one of the most simple questions to ask yourself is simply, where am I fragile? Where am I exposed? Both in investing and life. And one of the things that I decided in a very, really using this way of thinking that I've learned from the great investors was to say at the start of the pandemic, well, I'm probably 25 pounds overweight, which is probably being generous to myself. And I don't like exercise, and I have lots of stress, and I'm totally focused on my work, and my diet's not great. I know that increases my odds of dying, God forbid, if I get COVID. I don't have full control over what's going to happen with the pandemic, but I can wear a mask. I can keep my distance from people. I can be sensible. I can wash my hands, whatever, if that's important. And I can start to exercise regularly. And so, I mean, in a really banal way, we got a Peloton bike that's next to our washing machine. And I do, what I call the tour de laundry room, 5-6 days a week. And it's really simple, but that's a really good application where you're just saying, where am I fragile? Well, I'm fragile because I'm heavy, and I'm fragile because I'm not fit and because I'm stressed. And that's something that I can control. And this is one of the great lessons from the Stoics as well, is that you focus on what you can control. And so I think you apply that in every area of your life. Are you fragile in your relationship because you're neglecting your kids or your spouse? Are you fragile because you have a bad temper? And when we're stressed, we behave in ways that are not our best. And so that simple filter of figuring out where you're fragile and then systematically removing or reducing fragility, I think is enormously important. And one of the things that Howard Marks said to me, Howard's very much focused not on predicting the future, but on reducing fragility. He said, and he said one of the best ways of reducing fragility is just to live within your means. And so just to have a cushion. And Tom Gaynor said to me, if you're living within your means, you're rich already. And so these things like simply not overreaching, not taking ridiculous amounts of risk, particularly at a time like this, where a lot of people have made stupid money that makes us jealous, just in the same way that I was jealous of the guy who won the Oscar last night. That shouldn't knock me off course. I should acknowledge the fact that that's an issue and that I have an emotional response to that. And I should sigh and be like, yeah, okay, let me move on. That's part of the mix. But I'm playing a different game. I'm playing a game of writing. I'm playing a game of sharing the insights from the investors I've interviewed. A different thing. And same thing with investing. I'm playing a different game. I've interviewed Bill Miller so many times, and so many times he's told me why I should have bought Bitcoin, and I still haven't done it. And I wrote an article about him 20 years ago when Amazon's at $6. I never bought it. I just have to accept the fact that I'm playing a different game. And one of the things, one of the games that I have to be aware of that's different is he's a much better risk taker. He has, as Guy Spear said about Monish has balls of steel. And so you just have to be aware of how you are temperamentally and how you are intellectually. For me to buy Bitcoin now is really hard emotionally and intellectually. It's really easy for Bill. And the fact that people like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett and Howard Marks, all people he respects tremendously, all thought it was really stupid, doesn't bother him in the least. It's just not, if anything, I think it makes him more intrigued that everyone else has misperceived it. That's a tremendous advantage. And so I think knowing that you're playing a different game and that you don't need to buy the hottest, sexiest thing, you don't need to chase fads, that you're just trying to think independently, set yourself up to be directionally correct, live within your means, not overreach, keep adding to the pot, and being aware of your exposure rather than your experience. Those things go a hell of a long way towards making you very successful and at least beating 80-90% of the crowd. And that's kind of good enough. If it makes you financially independent and secure so you can do what you want and you don't have to be answerable to people you dislike and who are unpleasant, and you can send your kids to the colleges they want to go to, and you can retire and travel and whatever it is you want to do, live in a way that's in alignment with who you are. That's really important. And so I don't know. I think focusing on just being resilient and surviving and staying in the game, being long term, those are really core principles, I think.
So, bonus question, and this is always will be especially interesting with as widely as you read. And this is for a book recommendation.
Okay. I spend a ridiculous amount of time coming back to stuff that David Hawkins has written. And Hawkins, I write about briefly in the book as having had an enormous impact on Monish Pabrai, because he wrote this book, Power versus Force, which I do think is a very important book. The key idea that Monish got from it is basically that people smell whether you're being truthful or not. And to use Hawkins' language, there are certain characteristics, certain behaviors that make people go strong. And Hawkins believed in kinesiology, and I have no idea whether this stuff is replicable or not. He claimed it was. I don't know. So he would do muscle testing to prove whether a certain thing made you go strong or weak. But whether this is empirically the case, replicable or not, I think there's enormous power and resilience and robustness to his ideas. And his view was certain things like, for example, shame, guilt, lying, selfishness. They make people go weak. Even as I said that, I suspect there's like a little part of you that kind of sinks. And when you talk about behaving honorably, generously, kindly, truthfully, lovingly, compassionately, empathetically, joyful for no reason, sharing for no reason, there's actually a part of you that's like, you feel better. You're actually going strong. And so Hawkins would calibrate these different behaviors and different books and different people and different places. So you could say, what makes you go strong and what makes you go weak? And obviously what you want to do is elevate your consciousness more and more and elevate your behavior more and more and hang out with, as Buffett would say, with people who are better than you. Because if you put yourself in an environment that makes you go weak, it's going to have an effect on your behavior. So Power versus Force is a really important book, but then there are other books of his that I also read that I find really profound and important. And one of them that he wrote very late in his life is Letting Go, which I've been reading a lot lately. And he was a psychotherapist. He had, I think, the largest psychotherapy practice in New York before he became this mystic, who I think was probably enlightened, if you believe that there's such a thing, which I kind of do. And so I feel like he's actually revealing certain truths without necessarily making an intellectual argument. He's just revealing this is how this works. And letting go is very important and very interesting because it's an extremely practical technique that he's offering, which is, the subtitle of the book is, I think, The Path of Surrender. And what he's saying is, when you have negative emotions coming up or negative thought patterns, whether it's me feeling jealous of the guy last night who wins the Oscar, or me feeling terrible that I didn't buy Amazon, or that I missed Bitcoin, or feeling panicked because the market's plunging, or whatever it is, or overly giddy because it's surging. He said, instead of trying to change those emotions, those feelings, you abide with them and you become aware of what it's doing in your body, in your mind. And so you're not judgmental towards your feelings. You're simply conscious of them without trying to change them. And so you're in some ways surrendering the need to change your emotion. And his view is that the energy behind the emotion dissipates when you aren't trying to judge it or to change it. And because we know from Buddhist philosophy and from our own experience that everything changes, this is the title of one of my chapters, everything changes, every emotion, every experience, nothing is going to be stable. And so that feeling is then going to move on and change to another feeling. And so instead of trying to repress it, suppress it, or project onto someone else, for example, so if it's too painful for me to deal with my own sense of inadequacy, then I have to resent the guy who won the Oscar. Or if I'm still so wounded by the Holocaust in Arnold's case, and I'm so caught up by a desire for vengeance and hatred, it's going to ruin my life. And so I need to learn to forgive. And so again, it goes back to the Viktor Frankl thing of the gap between stimulus and response, giving you the freedom to choose. And so this is another technique, this letting go technique, that gives you the freedom to choose how you respond more intelligently to your own emotions and your own negative thought patterns. And similar to Ed Thorp just saying, oh, let me suspend judgment, or Ken Schubenstein saying, let me pause, let me reduce complexity, let me be aware of how my hunger, my anger, my loneliness, my tiredness, my pain, my sadness, my scaredness, how they're affecting my body and my mind, and just tread a little more carefully. And so these are all techniques, I think, to learn to deal more intelligently with your own emotion. And that, because we grew up not really being taught how to deal with our emotion, I think part of becoming a sane and functioning and responsible and decent adult, hopefully, is to reparent ourselves in some way and to figure out what works. And so when you see someone like Arnold doing things that work, that's a clue. Okay, that works. When you see what Hawkins, this psychotherapist and mystic, has figured out about certain things making you go strong, that's another clue. And then because of what Waitskin says about thematic interconnectedness, I love it particularly when I find parallels in different areas and different books where I can see that other people have come up with the same approach. And so there's a great Tibetan Buddhist teacher, a guy called Tsoknyi Rinpoche, Tsoknyi, and he's part of this extraordinary lineage that goes back 1,000 years of some of the greatest Tibetan Buddhists. And he's doing much the same thing. He has books like something like Open Heart, Open Mind, something like that, and Carefree Dignity is another of his earlier books. And he has a course online that I've been taking called Fully Being, that is it's long, it goes on a long time, for many months. I think it's extraordinary. And he has a very similar practice to Hawkins in some way, where instead of trying to change the emotion that comes up while you're meditating or while you're not meditating, he's just abiding with it in a warm and kind, non-judgmental way. And he has this lovely practice that he calls handshake practice, where you see the thing come up, the jealousy, the fear, the anxiety, the sadness, whatever it is. And you just say, yeah, hi, nice to see you, welcome, instead of suppressing it. And it dissipates and it changes and moves on. And that there strikes me as deep wisdom in that, and something really fascinating about the fact that they found the same different techniques to deal with the same thing without trying to repress, project, suppress, feel guilty or ashamed of your emotions, just dealing with them intelligently in a self-aware way and giving yourself the space to make better, more skillful decisions. And that there seems to be great profundity in that. And all of the fact that all of these things are pointing in the same direction, whether it's Hawkins, Tibetan Buddhism, Kabbalah, which is a path that I've spent a long time studying, they're all basically saying the same thing, because there's kind of one truth, right? It's not a separate truth that the Buddhists had and the Kabbalists had and the evangelical Christians had. You know, we're all trying to figure out our way through the fog. And these basic principles, like becoming kinder, more loving, dealing with our own errant, wayward emotions more intelligently, it's all kind of the same. And Tsoknyi Rinpoche has a lovely phrase for it, where he talks about these negative patterns, these negative emotions, as your beautiful monsters. And he says, one day, you and your beautiful monsters will all be friends. And so instead of having this tough approach that I would always have of like being full of, shame or guilt or self-loathing about these terrible aspects of my character, this gives me a new way of dealing with it, where I can say, okay, let me try to be a little gentler, a little more compassionate, a little more self-compassionate. And and it gives you a better way forward that I think is more resilient. And so much of investing and so much of life requires emotional resilience and equanimity to get through a period like COVID, to get through periods that are difficult in the market, to write a book, which is torture, at least in parts. Anything that's worthwhile that you do in the course of a long life is going to require some degree of strength and resilience and equanimity. And so I don't feel like these are separate questions that have nothing to do with investing. I think the markets are kind of brutal, and they expose these fault lines in our personality. And so if you can take very seriously this inner game of trying to control your thoughts and emotions and have a more intelligent handle on the impact that they're having on you, I think it sets you up to have a more successful life and also just a more joyful life. And it's certainly helped me a great deal. I still wrestle with this stuff often enough, but I think I'm a little quicker to notice when I'm getting off course. And so I use people like Hawkins or Sokmi Rinpoche or the Kabbalists as or just the role model of people like Arnold or Tom Gaynor or Nick Sleep as ways to remind myself, okay, let me just recalibrate. Let me get back to the true north, which is if I can try to be a little kinder, a little more honest, a little more truthful, a little more authentic. Those are things that in the long run, they work over time, I hope.
Well, William, I don't know if we can pack any more wisdom into this time period than you did already. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Before you go, do me the huge honor of picking up your copy of The Rebel Allocator, available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. It's a business person's guide to effective capital allocation, told in a coming-of-age story of a college grad who crosses paths with a wealthy Midwesterner. It's fiction for the nonfiction reader. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you'd like to support this author and purchase their book, click here. If you'd like to become a subscriber to 5GQ, click here. And I included a couple other interviews that you might appreciate right here. Thanks. Happy reading.